Now that we have the content and padding areas defined, let's style the border area of our wildlife div. So there are three properties we can use to create and style borders. First, we can set the width of a border with the border width property. So let's go back to our wildlife rule, and right beneath the padding declaration, let's type border dash width. And let's set the border width value to 10 pixels. Now we can also define border width value with any length or percentage units, or the keyword values thin, medium, and thick. Now, in order to actually see the border we apply to an element, we'll need to define a border style. So right beneath the border width declaration, let's type border dash style. Now, the border style property is what sets the style of the element's border. Some of the most common border styles are solid, dashed, and dotted. So let's go ahead and use the value dotted. And if we want to give our border a color, we'll need to use the border color property to set that color. So right beneath the border style declaration, let's type border dash color. And the border color values can be any of the keyword color values. It can also be a hexadecimal or RGBA value. So let's go ahead and use that orange hex value we used earlier. So let's make the border color value pound FFA 949. So now when we save our style sheet, bring up the browser preview and hit refresh, we can see how our div element has an orange dotted border that's 10 pixels wide on each side. And if we want to go back and give it a dashed border, we can change the dotted value to dashed. And when we take a look at it again, there's our fancy dashed border. But in our case, we'll want a solid border. So let's go back and set the border style value to solid. And now we have a solid border on each side. So like the padding shorthand property, these border properties can have anywhere from 1 to 4 values defined that set the border properties of each side of the div. So if we go to our border width value and add a second value of 20 pixels, when we take a look at our div once again, now the top and bottom border widths are still 10 pixels wide, while the left and right borders are now 20 pixels wide. And if we go back to our border style value and add a value of dotted, let's go back and refresh the page. So now our top and bottom borders are solid, while the left and right borders are now dotted. And the same goes for the color value. So if we go back and add the value red right before the hex value, when we refresh the page, we can see that our top and bottom borders are now red, while the left and right borders are still orange. So once again, remember what the order of these values mean. So if we go back to our border color value and add 2 more values, let's say blue and green. Now the first value will apply to the top border color, the second to the right, the third to the bottom, and the fourth to the left border color. So if we take a look at it again, we can see how we now have 4 different border colors on each side of our div. Now, most of the time, we're only going to use one border width, one color, and one style property on an element. So we can define them all in one shorthand border property. So back in our wildlife rule, let's go ahead and type border and define these values with a shorthand notation. So the first value we're going to define is for the border width. So let's make it 10 pixels. Next, we're going to define the border style. So let's type solid. And finally, we're going to define the border color. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the orange hex value. And now we can go ahead and remove the individual border properties since we now have them defined in the shorthand property. And when we take a look at it again and refresh, we can see how we get the same results we did earlier. But we're still able to use the granular border styles if we need to override one of these border values. So for instance, say we now need a dashed bottom border. Well, we can go back and add a border bottom style property. So right beneath the border declaration, let's type border bottom style. And if we set the value to dashed, when we save our style sheet and take a look at it once again, we can see how this styles the bottom border only. And we can do the same for border left style, border top style, and so on. Or if we need a different border color on a particular side, we can also write border, let's say left color, and let's make it green. And when we take a look at it again, we can see that now our left border is the color green. Now, what we want to do moving forward in our design is give our wildlife element a top border only. So let's go ahead and remove the border bottom style and border left color declarations. And we're going to change the border shorthand property to the border top shorthand property. So now when we save our style sheet, we can see that the styles are now applied to the top side of our div only. Finally, one more thing we need to know about border styles is that if no border color is specified, the border will take on the text color of that element. So for example, if we remove our border color and change the color to say red, when we save and take a look at it again, we can see how the border inherits and displays the red text color defined in the color property. So let's set our color value back to white and the border color back to that orange hex value. So now if we look through our style sheet and come across a border property, we know exactly what it means. So for instance, in the main footer rule, we can see that the border bottom style is solid and the color is the hex value shade of orange, while the border width is 10 pixels.